and Mrs. Obama will be there to pay their respects. Fox's Ed Henry just wrapped up an interview with former President Bill Clinton, who shared his memories of South Africa's late leader.
He talked to me in that prison cell as we grabbed the bars and looked out together about what it was like. And I said, tell me how this changed you. How did you give up 27 of the best years of your life and come out a better man than you went in? He said, I realized they could take everything from me, everything, except my mind and my heart. Those things I would have to give them. And he said, I decided not to give them away. He was free before he was released.
Amazing. Tributes have been pouring in over the last 24 hours.
We've lost one of the most influential, courageous, and profoundly good human beings that any of us will share time with on this earth.
Obviously extremely sad and tragic news. We're just reminded what an extraordinary and inspiring man Nelson Mandela was. And my thoughts and prayers are with him and his family right now.
Today a new low, lots of pain. And yet one can find solace in the fact that he accomplished the mission of using his mind, body, and suffering to end the racist political apartheid system.
Juan Williams spent a lot of time with Mandela after he was released from prison in 1990, and he joins us tonight. Juan, great to see you, and you must have a lot of thoughts and reflections about this great man that you got to know.
Well, you know what was interesting to me, and I think everyone will kind of be fascinated, that he was interested in us. I mean, the world drew inspiration from Nelson Mandela. But when I was with him, it was funny. It was almost like he was interviewing me about American politics and the American civil rights movement, you know, because in South Africa, the majority of the population is black. Here in the United States, majority white. And he wanted to know, well, wait a second, how did a minority in the United States achieve civil rights? So we ended up talking about, and he's fascinated with, the founding fathers. The idea that George Washington gives up power one term, something Mandela later does, but also citizenship, the whole idea that you have rights in the United States. Remember, blacks in South Africa had none of that. So in a sense, we were inspiring to Nelson Mandela.
I'm certain of that. Was there anything when you sat down with him that really surprised you? When I'm sure you prepared ahead of time and researched him and got to know the man through what you were able to read and hear from other personal anecdotes. But what did you take away from it?
You know, Kimberly, I think the thing that surprised me the most is I was saying, you know, Mr. Mandela, you are a beacon to the world in terms of freedom struggle, the sacrifice, the 27 years in jail, standing up for principle. And he was just, he started laughing. He didn't laugh easily. So I was like taken aback. I thought, hey, maybe there's some like, he's not understanding this American guy, you know. But no, he said, no, it's just that when he was growing up, all he wanted to do was rebel against his parents. He just wanted to get out of the, you know, the tribal situation. And he was like a prince and go to the big city of Johannesburg. He wanted to box. He wanted to learn poetry. He wanted what he called a Western-style education. And Kimberly, I think that stays with me. That, you know, sometimes we, especially in this holiday season, we forget what we have. You know, a Western-style education. This guy was willing to do anything for it, and rebel against his parents was what he wanted more than anything else. He didn't even see that he was going to become this worldwide legend.
All right, and Dana and Bob both have questions. We'll begin with Dana.
Juan, I'm curious about how it was that you were plucked out of the crowd of all the journalists that were there. How did it come to be that you were chosen in order to get a chance to talk to him? Because I know you worked it a little bit, but I would love to hear that story. And the second question I have is, what is the toughest question that he asked you in those interviews?
You know, Dana, I like the way you put it. You know I worked it, and I did work it, my friend. Because what happened was everybody was being turned away. Everybody wanted time with Nelson Mandela after he first got out, and here he is at his home. But what happened was I had written a book about the American Civil Rights Movement, Eyes on the Prize. Turns out he read the book before it became a TV series or anything, and so he wanted to meet the author, and they just put me in a line to shake hands. But I wouldn't let go of the guy. I said, hey, I really want to talk to you. You know, please, I'm from Washington, the United States of America. They were kicking me out. And finally he said, well, you can write. If you can write some thank you notes for me, you can stick around. I'll talk to you when I can. And so it wasn't like a direct interview. It was like, hey, Mr. Mandela, what about this? Or we sit down and have a meal and I'm talking to him, or he's meeting his grandkids. It was like that.
What a great experience. Now, Bob, you've had some personal experience as well with Nelson Mandela on behalf of work you did with Bishop Desmond Tutu.
Yeah, we're raising money for the Mandela charities in the United States, raised a lot of money for it. But Juan, let me ask you, you know, I remember vividly when you gave the commencement address to my son's school 2 years ago, and you talked about Mandela, and I have never seen a group of, which were then 17 to 18-year-olds, absolutely spellbound by what you were saying about Mandela. And they didn't know much about Mandela, but it was Mandela's words. I'm just wondering whether we think that this generation who never saw or heard much about Nelson Mandela will now, because of this week, we're going to get a lot of information about him, be inspired by his words.
I think so, Bob, you know, because I think for a lot of kids, even if you think about, you know, our history, Dr. King, you know, for my kids, a lot of that now is, you know, might as well be George Washington and the cherry tree. I sent a note to Dana earlier today about this. It just that they think it's history, but to suddenly get the sense of what was apartheid, I think they don't have any clue. That's just like, you know, water fountains in this country. It's like, what was that? You guys are bringing up old history. But now I think there might be some lessons here where they say, oh, so this is what Nelson Mandela stood up for. This is what it means to be someone who acts on principle and sacrifices for the greater good. And again, I think that's such a tremendous lesson. You know, like Dana was asking me, what's the most difficult question that I got from Mandela? And it was one about, you know, do you know who you are, where you're from? Imagine, you know, someone saying to me, where I said, what do you mean? He says, you know, do you know where your people came from? Do you know where you are from in Africa? And I'm like, you know, I don't know the answers. These are questions, I think, for everyone. I think all Americans, you know, we have roots around the world, but to say, who are you? Where are you from? It just, it's kind of, it shakes you.
All right, Greg?
I don't have a question, but I want to talk about the lesson that I've learned from the South African controversy and the experience. And it's about how taking sides ideologically often blinds you to the truth. The United States was against the ANC, the African National Congress, because they were communists. They were backed by the USSR. And the United States being staunchly anti-communist, that's the right team, but they might have made the wrong choice. Likewise, Nelson Mandela made the same exact mistake. He mistakenly embraced countries like Iran and Cuba and Gaddafi people because he misidentified them as comrades, when in fact it should have been the people in those countries that he identified with, because there were people under the thumb of Gaddafi and people under the thumb of Khomeini and other non-democratic countries. So one thing you learn is how ideology at times can blind you to some very important facts. It blinded me in the 80s because I was a staunch anti-communist, and I really didn't pay attention to what was going on in South Africa. All I knew was that the ANC was being backed by communists, and you learned that that was, even though that's true, South Africa was wrong. Secondly, quickly, if you feel really strongly about this man, you can still act, because there's plenty of people around the world who are under the thumb of evil, and there's a lot of celebrities who don't care. There are women still being circumcised in Africa. It's a horrible practice. There are gays persecuted in Iran. There are Christians in Islamic countries that are being persecuted. The time is ripe for a lot of new Mandelas.
All right, I like that, Greg. That might be my favorite comment you've made so far. Okay, all right.
Also, just a quick thought, and I don't have as much knowledge on Nelson Mandela as the rest of you, so I'll just say a man who appears to have a lot of passion, a lot of resolve, a lot of principle, not necessarily agree with a lot of the things that he stood for, so we'll say rest in peace. Also, very quickly, I think it's a nice outreach. President and Mrs. Obama reached out to the Bushes, 43, and they will be the Bushes will be joining the president on Air Force One to go to the memorial services next week. So interesting and nice way to bring some unity.
Appropriate respect and tribute. Bob, you have a quick question?
Well, I have a quick response to Greg, and then a question. I mean, look, it is true that he embraced these people, but they were the few people who were willing to embrace him. Mm-hmm. The United States held up sanctions. Ronald Reagan continued to veto sanctions, and in fact, Reagan had to be overridden by the Congress in order to get those sanctions put into place.
That was my point, though.
Yeah, okay, I understand, and I appreciate that. One just fast point here. Did the clerk, who also won the Nobel Peace Prize with Mandela, did an awful lot to help Mandela pave the way, the white Afrikaner. Do you think that's a fair statement?
Oh, yeah, I really do. And remember, they have a unity government. Mandela is the first democratically elected president of a multiracial South Africa. What does he do? He makes de Klerk his deputy president so that there is a clear sign to the country. This is about reconciliation. This is about moving forward. This is not about recriminations and bitterness. And that's the inspiring part. You know, I agree with you, Bob. You know, they were some of those countries, communist or whatever, were the few countries willing to support a Nelson Mandela. But you know what is the key is that afterwards he says no to violence and no to those communists.
All right, Juan, we want to thank you, our fellow co-host of The Five, for being with us tonight and sharing those reflections, special memories that you were able to be a part of in history. Coming up, Mr. Bob.
Okay. Now, I don't know if there'll be snow, but have a cup of cheer. Have a holly jolly Christmas, and when you walk down the street,